Hello, everyone. So just a quick check. Can you see the first slide of our presentation on your screen? Okay, thank you very much. So we will start at 9 o'clock sharp, so in about 3 minutes, and wait for another minute to lead more people into this breakout session. We have 3 minutes left until we start. To our speakers, Sonoko, could you please quickly check if your microphone is working?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me? Hello?
I do not hear you yet, but let me check if this is a problem on my side.
Can hear you.
Yeah, Christine says she can hear.
Okay.
Hello, Philip, can you hear? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
We hear you.
We hear you.
So Philip doesn't hear you, but we do.
So unfortunately, I don't have audio yet. Let me just check why this is the case. Sonoko, could you please once again say something? So
Yeah, hello.
Oh,
Philip.
perfect. Oh, I hear you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Great. So I think that we are ready to start. So hello everyone around the world. Welcome to this special workshop on what is needed to foster the transformation in agriculture. This workshop is organized by the Agricultural Systems of the Future, which is a research program funded by the German Ministry of Research and Education. So for more information about us, you can visit our website or follow us also on social media. You find our Twitter handle and web address in the right corner of the slide that you just see in front of you. So I'm Philip Albers. I'm a project manager at the Coordination Office, Agricultural Systems of the Future, which is located at the Leibniz Institute of Vegetable and Ornamental Crops. And together with my colleague, Monika Schreiner, which you just saw in the main room giving the presentation, I will be moderating this event. So we are eager to hear from you in our Q&A session. Please submit your questions later in the Q&A or during the panel discussion into the chat, ideally by writing your name, your question, and to whom you address the question. So also for a technically smooth course of the workshop, I would like to kindly ask you to switch your microphone off at all times, but you're of course invited to switch your camera on. So.
I think then let's jump into the topic. As I already said in the plenary session, we are really convinced that the design of agriculture, the futural design, will really is the key how the future will be of the planet as well as will be the future of our civilization. And yes, to address all these social and environmental challenges we already have seen and discussed, so, for instance, increasing greenhouse emission or the loss in biodiversity and in natural resources. I think we really have to reboot and reimagine how we produce food and how we consume our food. And also we are convinced applying bioeconomic principles in our already existing agri-food systems will bring more sustainability in our agriculture. And so we think then we will offer yes, a broad variation of solution pathways for increasing biodiversity and for creating new food sources and protein alternatives, and also really to establish smart farming as well as complete circular farming systems. So, and with that in mind, we really would like to identify together today what are the barriers and what are the important incentives to bring more bioeconomy in agriculture. And really we would like now to discuss what is needed to foster agriculture in bioeconomy directions together with all our invited speakers today.
Yes, so and for that we have invited 3 experts for our breakout session here today. I would like to briefly introduce our guests. So first we have Sonoko Bellinghaupt-Kimura, who is a professor at the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research, who will give us first a short impulse talk presentation. And then we have Professor Christine Watson from Scotland's Rural University College, who will follow with the next subsequent presentation. And we invited Professor Tilman Brook from the Leibniz Institute of Vegetable and Ornamental Crops, who will join into our subsequent panel discussion. So without further ado, and with the sake of saving time, I would now like to hand over to our first speaker, Sonoko. Please, could you give us your presentation? The screen is all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to introduce our research on the agricultural system of the future. I will introduce our consortium and also the regarding issues regarding all the bioeconomy in the agriculture of the future. Next slide, please. So first, I will also go with the background. You already heard in the morning all the global challenges and changes, but I emphasize it again because it's the background and the base where we have where we build our research. So one important part is the increased food, feed, and fiber demand due to the growing world population. In the world, in the total, it's growing, but if you see in the figure, there are differences between regions, especially those changes in Asia and Africa are big. And in addition, which cannot be seen in this graph, but there are big changes in the rural and urban developments. There are big changes. Next, please. And that goes to the increased environmental load and losses. Here, a map on the reactive nitrogen in the 1990s. And before the Industrial Revolution, there was no more reactive nitrogen per hectare in the world, more than 20, like those brownish one. But now you can see that there are more than 50, and that is increasing in those active agriculture region, which is the most driving force for the nitrogen. There are, of course, other resources like energy, water, and other material, and we have to make it more, use it more efficiently and close the nutrient cycles. Next, please. And of course, we have to use more the natural services called the ecosystem services. And you can see here a picture of the soil properties. In the center, there are just the pH or silt or clay informations, which goes to the soil function, which has different functions leading to different ecosystem services, leading to the human well-being. It's a nice flower showing that there's a direct link from the function to the service. And we have to use it much more to have a sustainable bioeconomy and have to pay more attention on various services, but on just the biomass production which the soil provides. Next, please. And of course, the climate change, adapt and mitigate to the climate change, reduce the greenhouse gas emission, and create resilient systems. And of course, climate change is not just the temperature increase, there are much more extreme events, and also the precipitation patterns will change, and so it will be faced on the flood in the one aspect and also the drought on the others. So we have to deal with these global changes on the climate. Next, please. And of course, there's a big discussion on the biodiversity. Here a picture which shows the birds from the UK, which shows that the farmland birds are the most vulnerable ones in the recent years, which are decreasing. So if you say the decrease in biodiversity, it's not general. Of course, there are hotspots where the decrease happens, for example, in the tropics, but in our temperate regions in the Europe, there are, of course, most parts which are affected by our activities as a farmland, and the farmland birds exhibits one of the higher hierarchy, and all the insect and the other smaller biodiversity also decreased most rapidly in the farmlands. So next, please. So those are the overwhelming global changes which we want to meet the SDGs in regards to those changes. These are big challenges. But I also want to emphasize that the changes and challenges are also a big chance. So for example, we can develop new market values by putting value on ecosystem services, biodiversity, and resource efficiency. It's getting much more of a value. We already heard about the new technologies. So the sensors and models exist that, for example, documentation, forecasting, and controlling on site-specific effects of agriculture activities can be realized. New small-scale and site-specific management system can be possible due to the small robots, for example. New operating models enables us to develop new operation goals and also optimal planning and support complex decision. For example, if you have the new market values, there are various ecosystem services, biodiversity beside production of biomass. So you have to deal with those complexities. There are a support tool for that. And last but not least, there will be new cooperation possible among farmers or also consumers and society due to the information that can be much easier handled among the different sections. Next, please. So now we want to design a new landscape, especially in our project in the agriculture system of the future. You can imagine a vast landscape. And next, please. So you want to design it. So I just wrote an ideal picture how the agriculture of the system can be in the future. So our vision is that it will be spatially and functionally diversified, and that there is a production system, and that allows harmonization of diverse land use goals. As I said, there will be various aspects to be considered, but the production, all the ecosystem services, biodiversity, all the climate aspects. So there will be different aspects necessary to be met. And so we think that it cannot be met at the same place, all the aspect is the same place, but a diversification can be smaller field, like here in the center, the smaller fields in the center, but there will be also larger fields, fields that are allocated along the landscape gradient, like you see in the right edge with the wind power masts, and also there will be for example, frog cultivation area in the island in the river. So there will be diversification for different goals, which is written on those bubbles. Next, please. And Professor Schreiner will introduce the whole 8 agriculture of the systems sub-project, and the darkies was somewhere in the center, and that also illustrate our vision that we want to have a diversified system. So that fits, I think, all the separate visions, so that will it's not one vision. There will be several visions which should be integrated in a landscape. And of course, our agriculture system says future darkies in the right edge, you can see it's a diversified smart landscape. It's one of the aspects, but in the future, all the systems should be integrated to have a diverse, resilient system. Next, please. And what we are doing concretely in our project is like this. For the digital aggregate knowledge and information system, DARKIS, we analyze different information, for example, here on a field, one single field, where we have the soil points, these are the soil quality information, or the slope angles, soil humidity and solar radiation. Sorry, there are some words still in German. Those will be mixed, and with other integrated information with climate and NDVI and electronic conductivity, we will segregate a field into different qualities. So usually one field is not homogeneous, even though the smaller field in Asia, I just heard one presentation from Japan that even a 0.3 hectare big field are very heterogeneous. So in this case, this is a 7 hectare large field, which can be divided into as high soil quality, moderate soil quality, and moderate soil quality at slopes. And these are 1 point a few meters, and in the current agriculture practices with large machines, it's not possible to manage, and we are now considering some compromise between the current available technologies and the technologies for the futures. But in the in future, if the robotics available, those spots can be also realized. In the reality, we will do practice not with the small points, but in rather large areas. But that will be one of the way how we meet the segregation in the future. Next slide, please. So in the landscape scale, in a larger scale, up from the field, there can be also analyzed which fields are vulnerable, which can be improved. For example, in the right and the left edge, you see the erosion potential calculated for each field for the last 5 years. And below there, the revenue of the euro per hectare for each field in the average of the 5-year crop rotation. If you plot them against, you can see that there are fields which has low revenues. Here we calculated without subsidies, so to calculate the real economic value. So there, of course, there are no minus. Farmers won't do any minus activities. They have some revenues, but in this case, if you don't count for the subsidies, there will be some vulnerable or not economically land use, which has large erosion potential. So in those cases, those land uses or those fields as circulated by the red circle are the most ones we have to analyze much further how to improve those crop rotation in both aspects, for the revenue, for the economical impact, but also for the erosion potential. So they have already this erosion risks. Of course, it depends on the climate and condition whether this happens or not, but they have the risk. And also they don't seem to be very economic, so they have to be changed. And by analyzing those one, adding more y-axis for biodiversity, other ecosystem services, we can create much more solid decision for farmers to choose which management practice will be conducted in the field, in combination to the previous slide where we segregate the field, analyze the field potential in the field scale to have a much more site-specific and detailed information how to improve the use of one area. So next, please. So that already sounds very complicated, and here it shows our work, how it goes. We are quite proud that we have this kind of flow chart, even though you won't see anything with the small letters. It's I just wanted to show that each graph, each single square there with different colors indicate different work groups and work activities that has to be connected to have to reach in the left side the decision support tool, including all the site-specific management and the field scale, erosion and revenues and other ecosystem services at the landscape scale, and to analyze it for much more practical way. It should be some kind of simple decision support tool. Now we think it's not an app on the cell phone because it's already too complicated. It should be have a bigger screen in a tablet or laptop to get all the information comprehensively visualized. And it should be finally at the end of our project a solid and simple decision support tool for farmers and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. So for now, just I want to add what kind of incentive can be put to enhance ecosystem services and biodiversity. One, of course, is the agri-environment climate measures from the EU, for example. It shows the cap for German from 2014 to 2020. And as you know, the EU pays a lot of 40% or so of the budget for agricultural subsidies or those incentives. So that can be used much better. And as you already also heard, the next change of the cap doesn't make it so much difference in this paying systems. So the agri-environmental measure in the green part of the second pillar is very small compared to the first pillars. And we want to make a solid decision support also for this EU level policy to get better decision for improved agriculture land use for much more sustainable use. Next one. Besides the policy, there are also, of course, other incentives which we can put in this. If you remember the graph with the erosion in the revenue in the x-axis, there can be also improved in other ways. This is an example of a project which we do together with WWF and EDECA, where we put additional value for organic products. So you can see here the real products in the meat form in the left side. They are at the circles in the right map. They are the farmers joining our project, and they are increasing. They have a high attention also from the society as well as from the farmers. And if you think about organic farming, it's already good, but still not good enough for biodiversity. So we add here some simple point system for organic farming, which we also control, so that to improve their practices much better, and they have really good market chances for those products. Next one. Besides adding price to the products, there are also other ways to put values for ecosystem services. There's direct trade. It's already started now. You can, if you check the website, you can also participate in this system and buy some ecosystem services. This was considered for mostly for much companies and municipals who want to contribute one, and that here farmers and other organizations can put their measure for improving ecosystem services, and somebody can buy it. So you can also have a direct value for paying for ecosystem services, which is already now in real economical life. And next, final slide. So for other steps, just to sum up this, our ideas from the project is, of course, I'm also a researcher. So one thing I think it's important is, of course, the research and development, capturing of indicator in real time, for example, or better management is still not good enough for the reality. We have to improve this part. And tools for much more pragmatic tools for easy and practical decision support is necessary. Policy incentives, for example, the Green Deal or CAP or other measures are of importance. Valorization of non-commodity products, that is ecosystem services in biodiversity in the value chains, like the example of WWF or this Agora Natura marketplace should be necessary. And of course, the awareness of consumers and citizens who are willing to pay a higher price or putting their tax for those aspects will be of importance. So that will be my part for the introduction, for this session. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Sonoko, for your talk. So Christine, am I right? Do you want to share your presentation now, or?
Yes, I will share my presentation.
So I'll stop this one here. Okay.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today about diversifying food and farming systems and some of the reasons why we might want to do that. Using some examples, mainly from Northern Europe, but the principles are applicable much more widely than that. I want to start from the idea that was nicely summarized by the poet, the American poet, Wendell Berry. If you eat, you are involved in agriculture. How we eat determines to a considerable extent how the world is used. So we all have a very direct connection into land use, even though we don't always think about it that way. And there have been many reports, and you can pick anyone you like, many reports about the future of agriculture over recent years. And I just want to pick on a couple. The Eat Lancet report from 2019 talks about refocusing agriculture from producing high volumes of crops to producing varied and nutrient-rich ones. And on a similar theme, the IPES food report from Uniformity to Diversity in 2016 says what is required is a fundamentally different model of agriculture based on diversifying farms and farming landscapes. And that's the theme of what I'm going to talk about. So why bother to diversify? Well, clearly we're looking to develop resilient and sustainable food and farming systems in terms of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. What is it that diversity can deliver to us? And it's very much about thinking about ecosystem services. So thinking clearly about provisioning of food and fibre and fuel, but also the other services that diversified agriculture can provide in terms of regulating services and supporting services, but also cultural services. There are many very diversified traditional systems. If we think for a minute about what a system might look like, and think about the way in which nutrients flow or matter flows around a system from the sort of primary production down here of crops and clearly crop residues too, and grass, through the sort of direct consumption of those materials by humans and by animals. And maybe in the future we're looking at extracting protein direct from grass and processing it into human food. We can do it already. Apparently it just doesn't taste very nice, so perhaps not such a good thing to do just at the moment. But the idea that we can diversify in many different respects. We can think about dietary diversification. What is it that we can change about what we eat, and how will that affect production? We can think about the diversification in the field of crops and grass species, and whether that's temporal or spatial, and I'll come back to that. We can think about diversifying the kind of livestock we produce, perhaps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, perhaps moving away from ruminant provision. We can think about diversification in the supply chain. How can we utilize these different products that we're producing? So those all come together to help us think about the ways in which we might diversify food and farming systems. So I'm going to give you just 3 examples of a field or a rotation level of way of diversifying the system. And the little person at the bottom scratching their head is there to remind me to say that actually these might in some respects be lower input systems, but they might also be higher input systems in terms of the amount of management and thought and planning and innovation which goes into making these systems work, both biologically and economically. So the first one I'm going to talk about is how we can diversify crop rotations to increase soil carbon. We hear a lot about the importance of storing more carbon in soil and of sequestering carbon. There've been a couple of very nice studies published in the last few years about the impact of diversifying crop rotations. So the first one is a meta-analysis from McDaniel et al. In 2014, who found that by just adding one extra and different crop into a monoculture, you could increase soil carbon by over 3%. And if you added a cover crop in between the main crops in a rotation, you could actually increase soil carbon by 8.5%. There's another Swedish system, Swedish paper from long-term experiments that have been in the ground for up to 24 years, showing that you can sequester a third of a ton of carbon for every year that you include a ryegrass cover crop in a rotation. So this isn't about making massive differences, but about how you can manipulate a rotational system to increase the soil carbon. Another good example is about the value of putting legumes into rotations. I think we're all probably in this audience familiar with the idea that legumes fix nitrogen from the atmosphere through a symbiosis of bacteria within the root systems of legumes. So what's the value to putting those into the system? Well, clearly as a crop, they deliver protein, but they also deliver to the next crop in the system. And this is, again, a meta-analysis from Mark Peoples. And what we've got here is what happens when we plot the yield of wheat grown after a legume against the yield of wheat grown after wheat. And if the legume made no difference, all the points would sit on that one-to-one line. But they don't. They almost all sit above that one-to-one line, showing a benefit of wheat to the following crop. Obviously, it differs with what the crop is. Part of that is a nitrogen effect from this nitrogen that's left in the crop residues of the legume, but it's also about changing the soil biology. It's also about perhaps an impact on pests and diseases, on beneficial soil microorganisms, on soil structure. So it's a systems level benefit of different kinds. We can also think, so that's if you like a rotational diversity or a temporal diversity. We can also think about changing the diversity within the field. And here we've got 2 examples. The first one is lentils shown with, it's chickpeas growing underneath barley. And you can see that the chickpeas grow at ground level and the barley grows higher up. And you're getting a better spatial use of resources in a horizontal perspective. If you look at the right example, it's peas grown with barley, and you can see there the better vertical use of space. So a traditional concept, growing legumes and cereals together. And when you harvest it, you get a mixed grain. So that, people are not always keen on the idea of then having to separate that. But what can we do about that? Well, we can think about that in different ways. We are within a European remix project, working with a machinery company, actually working on how you utilize combines, how you set harvesting to be able to easily separate these different types of grain without damaging them, which is very important. But you can also look at it in other ways. Can we think about diversifying the food products made from these so that the products being actually utilize both grains together and no need to separate? There are all sorts of ways in which we can use both technology and a little bit of creativity to think about how to maximize the benefits of the system. The Chinese intercrop in a different way with strips of intercrop rather than a mixed a mixed stand of the legume and the cereal, and have specialized machinery which goes through and cuts the different strips. Lots of different ways of approaching this. Another way of diversifying the system is to introduce perennial crops into the farm, not necessarily into the rotation, but could be into the farm in general. An example of that is perennial wheatgrass, which, if you look at the root to shoot ratio, spring wheat has a root to shoot ratio of 0.33. Look at how big the root to shoot ratio is of intermediate wheatgrass. So as you can see here, the biomass of the crop, the enormous root biomass and forage biomass, not so very much grain in these systems, but there are people looking at breeding this to develop more grain, but it produces a lot of biomass and a lot of carbon, as you can see from this nice picture of the root system here. And then you can diversify what you do with it. There are people producing beer, saving their strapline is saving the planet one beer at a time. So lots, again, thinking about the ways in which we use different crops. And of course, as I say, you might not want perennial wheatgrass in your rotational system, but maybe it can be used as a buffer strip. Maybe there are ways of introducing it into the landscape, which again bring the diversification benefits. Agroforestry is another traditional system, but perhaps we're thinking about new ways of using that. So this is a photograph taken in Sweden, where we've got arable crops with rows of trees, but the trees are producing sea buckthorn, a very high value crop. And here we have some more traditional systems in Scotland and in England, with livestock grazing underneath trees. And you can see in the right-hand picture, the benefit to the livestock of utilizing the shade from those trees. So lots of ways of diversifying systems. And the final example I want to use is that we can not only do all of this at the field scale or at the farm scale, but perhaps we can think about the landscape scale. And over the past 50 years, we've seen an enormous sort of separation in agriculture of crop production and livestock production. And that's led to benefits in terms of efficiency. But what we're realizing is that it's not always beneficial for other reasons. So we're seeing in many arable areas a decline in soil fertility as a result of having moved the livestock away. So this is the kind of, maybe we think about the traditional farm and the children's song about old MacDonald had a farm, and on that farm he had a sheep and he had a cow and he had a pig and he had a chicken. We're not necessarily thinking about a return to every farm having some livestock, but the idea that within the landscape we can pair up farms, that we can introduce livestock from one farm to another to share resources. And if we look at Scotland, we see that we've got a lot of dairying and livestock production in the west of the country, and then the more intensive production of arable crops and fruit crops in the east of the country. And we've got farmers looking at ways of coming together in partnerships to make better use of perhaps moving livestock into arable areas to build soil fertility, and then making better use of the livestock in the summer in the west for the grazing. There are lots of challenges. There are challenges about the social aspects of that. There might be animal welfare challenges or animal health challenges, but we need to look at new ways of doing things like reintegrating crops and livestock. So really just to finish up, I've used the phrase here, mind the gap, the future will be different. How do we make this diversification happen? Well, I think a greater integration of science and practice can make change happen more effectively. Farmers and practitioners are very dynamic sources of innovation. They're very dynamic sources of problem solving. And I think by bringing research and practice together, we start to develop pragmatic solutions across the entire food chain. But it does require change. It requires social change as well as biological change in terms of collaboration and cooperative approaches. For sure, it uses the kind of technologies that Sunoco was talking about, the kind of precision approaches that can be applied in many ways. And we can apply this lots of different ways at lots of different scales. There's no one solution. It's not a one-size-fits-all system. There are a lot of options, and it's thinking about what works where and how we develop those. And I want to really finish, as I started, with a quote. This is from Dwight Eisenhower. farming looks mighty easy when your plough is a pencil and you're 1,000 miles from the cornfield. But to actually make things change and make things happen isn't mighty easy. And it's going to take a lot of different brains, a lot of different ideas, new technologies and traditional technologies to bring farming systems together, to diversify them and to deliver the benefits that diversification can bring. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you very much, Sonoko, for your nice and interesting talks. Christine, I saw that you now switched off your presentation, right? Presentation off, okay. So thank you both. Yeah, perfect, thanks. So thank you both. So we heard two very fascinating talks about the urgence of diversifying our farming systems. And I think we can all agree that there is a need that we have to change the way we produce and grow our food. So the question is there a way for us to foster this transformation? Because that there is a need for a transformation is absolutely clear. So I want to come back on some policy issues and some policy topics that also Sonoko mentioned in her talk. So Sonoko, you mentioned the policy incentives such as the Green Deal or the EU's Farm to Fork strategy. I think it's very important that when we talk about managing this transformation efficiently, it is probably very important to also define very clear and specific goals as for example, the EU's Farm to Fork strategy has also numbered or written down a number of important goals. So if you would take a look at these goals that for example have been published with the EU's Farm to Fork strategy, how do you evaluate these goals? So is there need for improvement if we talk about fostering or fostering this whole process? What do you think?
I would not evaluate the goals. I think they are all very nice. For example, this goals to reduce pesticide by 50%. It will be really good if we can achieve this one. So not everything should or can be organic, but if we reduce it, it's already very good. But still, there is some lacking to compare to which you compare 50% reduction of. To compare to organic, it's already too much. If you compare to very intensive system, you are very easily to reduce 50%. So in this case, you have to, I think this one is not so clear, which is, for example, this values can be quantified for the putting some value into a product, as you see as our project in the WWF to increase biodiversity. We have concrete point system how to increase biodiversity. So even though organic farming, if they do practices that improve biodiversity, like hedges or cutting time of the grasses and so on, which is not typically organic, it can be done by any kind of farms, but they improve biodiversity. So those are criteria which we put some points. So in the same way, if you want to put some value to a product, so for example, much more local sale of a vegetable or trade, then which is local. So compared to shipping something from Africa or Asia or South America or fresh product to Europe, it's everything Europe production is local. So that we should be, this dimension should be clarified, and also like with a for scientific view, like life cycle assessment should be quantified to compare in the real value to have a proof that this one is better than the other products or have a additional value to be paid. So that should be quantified and clarified and very easily, like an ample system or point system for the consumer, that they don't have to read the small letters in the behind, but very comprehensively see that this product is some higher value in the quality and in the environmental aspects.
Thank you.
So from the consumer's orientation, how to evaluate sustainability, I would like to ask Christine, because Christine, you have convincingly demonstrated how diversifying agricultural systems will lead to more increased sustainability. So when I'm looking for bioeconomic principles, also circularity is a high issue. How do you think could diversified systems could promote circularity? Could you give us an example?
Thanks. Yeah, I think this idea of sort of partnerships between farms, or maybe partnerships between farming and industry, help us to think about the circular economy. If, for example, we can use a residue from a food processing plant, let's say a biscuit factory, if the residue can be taken and fed to local livestock, then that perhaps frees up land to do something different with, because it doesn't need to produce food for those animals. So I think there's a circularity there. I think we could also look at the introduction of diverse crops. So something like hemp, for example, is a crop which can produce high quality food in terms of protein, but then the other parts of the crop can be used for everything from sort of craft and producing jumpers to building materials. So I think by looking at how we produce the crops and how we utilize crop residues, I think we can see a contribution of diversification into the circular economy.
Oh, yes, thanks for the nice example.
Thank you, Christine. So, Timon, I would like to ask you the next question. So, we talked about the importance of diverse agricultural systems that focused especially on rural areas so far. So the Food for Future project, where you are also part of, in contrast, studies sustainable food systems for especially urban areas. So you also apply to extreme scenarios, so to speak, in this Food for Future project. One is, if I'm correct, no land, and the other one is no trade. So do these scenarios that you lie under the Food for Future project, sorry, once again, so do these scenarios and the solutions that you work on in this project also have something to do with bioeconomy and circularity and so on?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. The reason we chose to think about what happens in the bioeconomy if either or both of those scenarios took place, no land and no trade, was that we thought to some extent agriculture is moving away from using land and is increasingly trying to find value added in processes which are, let's say, less land dependent. But what if we had, for example, nuclear contamination like we did in Chernobyl in Europe? Then we can't use land the way we like. Or if we have massive urbanization, then land so disappears for agriculture, we have to find other ways of producing. No trade could be the result either of increased transport cost with carbon duties, or it could be the result of political policies, protectionism, what we saw under Trump. And so both the consumers of the future reside in urban areas, and urban growth is sort of unbroken, but also there may well be good reasons why we can't rely on the countryside and the sort of two-dimensional spaces to produce food. And under those circumstances, we thought, well, what technologies exist to help us to reconnect consumers and producers, even inside mega cities? And we thought maybe consumers might produce food in their own homes, have boxes in which something sort of brews or stews or grows or crawls or creeps, and they may be growing microgreens, or they may be growing insects in their own home as a protein source. Or in the city, we could have vertical gardens, which could also represent a visual manifestation of food production in urban areas. But just as an aside, if you have that, then presumably you want to also tackle urban pollution, because you wouldn't want all the dust particles and all the pollution spoiling your greens, which you then want to eat for dinner the same day. So I think we need to align different policies to both protect against negative shocks that can happen, like Hiroshima or protectionism, if I can call it that, but also to enable the technologies to really take place. And so we need good regulation to steer us in that way. And maybe quick final thought is change can sometimes happen much faster than we expect, like the coronavirus pandemic has demonstrated very clearly. So I think we set ourselves a target of thinking so 30 or 40 years ahead, but sometimes change is just around the corner and it happens much faster. And so it really pays to be prepared and to think ahead.
Thank you, Tamar.
Tim and Brooke just mentioned that changes could happen much more quicker as we expected. And I think really to be resilient against crisis, we should have more focus on eco-service services. So Noko, you already discussed that also the consumer have to be convinced that in the price ecosystem service should be included. So why do you think that for the whole agri-food chain, supply chain, the recognition of ecosystem services is so important? What is really, why is it the key of all decisions?
Yes, because yeah, for continuous growth, of course, in a very closed system, if you exclude all the lands, it's maybe a closed system may be possible, but there you already also may have some services which the plant and the microorganisms provide. And in the area-based agriculture, it's much more important because it has direct effect on agriculture activity, has, for example, a direct effect on the sea lives, for example. So it has a big dimension which impacts. So that is one aspect that we have to take into account. That one activity is like also like CO2. It is affecting the whole global climate. So a small activity can impact on a big, large scale, but not in a direct way. So you are not responsible for the temperature rise if you ride a car one time, but if you do continuously, so it is a dimension differences which we cannot realize. On the other hand, this is direct impact, for example, the soil ecosystem services. So I want to emphasize on that part because it's the most direct thing you can see as a farmer or a consumer, which the farmers do. So if there's, for example, if the soil is eroded, you really see some crusts and the soil flies all over the place, and you cannot drive a car and so on. You cannot see, so it's a direct effects. And you see that the nutrient availability reduces. So that one, it's a direct effect on your production for the next year, even though you might have one in this year. For the continuous use, you have to be concerned about the soil ecosystem services which directly affect. And those parts, as you see in the nitrate leaching discussion, that there is a high concentration, the nitrate concentration in the underground water. It didn't happen since I was a small student, so the issue continues because it has no value. It's only sanction, not a value. So if you have to turn around the direction, if it is not an incentive, and if you can sneeze around somehow, people do it because the economic existence is much more of importance. So that's why this services has to be included as a value of activity that has to be improved through governance, through prices, through awareness in various dimensions.
It's a comprehensive issue.
Thank you, Sonoko. So Tilman, I think in the end, it's also clear that the consumers also decide how much bioeconomy, how much sustainability they want, especially when we price in ecosystem services, loss of biodiversity, and so on. So you are a socioeconomist. So what do you think? Do consumers buy into this transformation?
This is a great question to an academic, because on the one hand, yes, and on the other hand, no, right? So let's look at what the factors are that drive this sort of ambivalent answer. And consumer choices are driven, of course, by many factors, so such as technology, prices, preferences, regulatory schemes, etc. And on the one hand, supply can create some demand. So if companies put out new products, or if there's some new choices, then that might lower prices, and so people are induced to buy these products. On the other hand, sometimes the demand can also create the supply. So if people are really keen on something, then business will try to satisfy that demand. Yeah, some social trend or something people really want to have. And I think what can happen is that there are even social trends. There's a sort of a desirability issue, and people are willing to pay premium. We saw it with organic. Initially, the premium and the markup was quite high. It's maybe slowly being driven down. There'll always be some markup, presumably. But some people really want to use it even to build their identity, to buy these products, and it's important for them sort of morally and psychologically, and so they're willing to pay that. And because they're willing to pay, it's actually not just a good, sort of good biology and good environmental protection or good ethical issue, but it's also good business to get into that. And so I think that's the sort of feedback mechanisms that we have to try to create, these win-win-win propositions, which are good for the environment, good for business, and good for consumers. And I think if we manage that, then we can move forward. But it's key to take the consumer with you and not to disregard her or him. Thank you.
Thank you, Tilman.
I would come back to Christine and the diversified system. Do you think also that bring that into practice, that there might be a better interconnection, a better collaboration between research and business? And if so, what is the main barrier that it doesn't happen as good as it should be?
Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to come up with practical solutions that industry, and whether that's farming or manufacturing or the food industry, really buy into, then I think, yeah, we absolutely need a better collaboration between science and practice. How do we make that happen is a good question. I think it is about the way in which research is funded, perhaps, and also the way in which universities and research institutes engage with industry. Do we need kind of perhaps different funding models which allow researchers or scientists to spend more time in industry and to develop those relationships? Because good research often happens on the basis of good collaboration and good relationships. And it's allowing people the space and the time to develop those relationships and to utilize the good ideas that can be generated across different parts of the sector. But I think it's also recognition of the value of applied research, that in many cases, researchers are rewarded for scientific outputs, but actually there's a real importance, I think, in terms of food and farming, about reward for developing practical solutions which actually transform and change agriculture.
So we need mutual experience in both directions, and we have to rethink also science outcome.
Absolutely.
Ms. Philip Albers, your micro is...
Okay, so now you can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes, I can.
I think we cannot finish this discussion also without mentioning the Corona crisis once. So as an economist, what do you think how the crisis contributes to the transformation of agricultural systems? Does it maybe also lead to more bioeconomy? What would you say?
Well, I think there's several issues, and every crisis, of course, is an opportunity, is an excess. So on the one hand, it shows us that we have to be prepared, and that change may come quickly, as I said before. But I think it also highlights the importance of having resilient value chains, both locally and globally. And maybe sometimes it's good to have good global value chains. Maybe sometimes it's good to have good local value chains. And so, really thinking that through and not just looking at it from a cost point of view, but in a wider societal sense, and including the externalities of having these value chains and their fragility. I think another issue that we should look at is that the Corona crisis is likely to lead to structural change in consumer demand. I mean, it may be somewhat temporary, but some of it might also be long-term, like how we consume and what we consume and how we consider food and the importance of food, and how we organize our meals and our calorie supply and so on. And I think there may be for years to come less restaurant meals and more takeaway, just to give a very small example. But that has implications for the sector, of course. And I think another final issue that I think is really important is the psychosocial well-being and the need for people to feel a sense of control I think a lot of people just now are really appreciating the therapeutic value of nature, and sort of, you know, we're conducting a survey. Oh, I should do a small advertisement. Livewithcorona.org. Please take the survey if you're interested. So on livewithcorona.org, we asked people to tell us what they're doing. And a lot of people around the world have been really interested and have gotten engaged with home gardening and growing their own crops. And I suspect it's not really to provide themselves with calories on a large scale. I think it's because there's psychosocial benefits from gardening, and it gives you a sense of control, and it gives you a sense of literally being grounded. And I think people appreciate that in the crisis. And so it might change our view of nature and how close we are to nature, and make us realize what our relationship with nature is. And so I think while COVID is awful and a humanitarian disaster, you know, maybe some strength can come from crisis, and maybe some of our resilience can be strengthened both individually and as a society. Thank you.
Thank you, Tilman. So I think we just have 3 minutes left until the organizers will cut the connection of this breakout session. So I would like to ask our three speakers to briefly summarize maybe the most important aspects, how or what is needed to foster the transformation. So Nuko, could you wrap up maybe your final concluding remarks?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to answer the chat. So, yes, I think the various the diversification and various skills must be necessary, and that includes the aspect from the home garden enclosed system towards the landscape. If the landscape is not nice, I think we are not our psychological situation will also not very well. So this should be all in line, and I think this will be important for us to visualize or to make a vision how we want to have it in the future. And for that, I think our 8 projects are very nice to have to give some vision with some real data. So that will be my contribution, which I think we can do. And for my part, it will be the landscape aspect to increase the biodiversity, improve ecosystem services, that we have a nice environment where we want to live in the future.
Hey, thanks. Christine, could you go next then?
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I think really just to try and summarize that if we're going to develop new and more diverse food and farming systems, then we need to work together, we need to be creative, we need to think outside of the box so that we can co-design systems that really work both from the perspective of delivering ecosystem services, but that also work from delivering to the bioeconomy.
Thank you, Christine. Tilman, your final remarks.
Well, it is literally 1 minute to the hour, and the need for the transformation is urgent. I think we can't force people to be or to do good. So we always have to remember what people want and what they do and what their individual incentives and actions are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to everyone watching this breakout session. So we hope it inspired you. This breakout will continue at 4 p.m. Central European Time, and we will summarize all the outcomes and the results of this workshop in the final plenary session, which will start at 5 p.m. today. So we are looking forward to seeing you there again. If you'd like to continue the discussion with us, we encourage you to get in contact with us, visit our website, and get in contact with us via email. And we wish you a very nice continuing of this Global Bioeconomy Summit. Thank you very much to everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.